The steak knife was inches from her hand when the head of the Doyle organization shoved a blood-smeared surveillance transcript across the linen and demanded that she, of all people, prove she wasn't stupid. He expected her to cry. Instead, Marlowe Ashford read the Balkan cipher scrawled across the page. And the most feared man in 3 boroughs went perfectly, terribly still. The Gilded Stag occupied the ground floor of a converted carriage house on Mercer Street. All oxblood leather booths, brass sconces, and a chandelier that had once hung in a Newport mansion before somebody's divorce lawyer sold it off piece by piece. The air smelled of duck fat, cracked pepper, and old money, pretending not to notice new money. Marlowe moved through the narrow channels between the booths with the kind of quiet, practiced grace that came from 3 years of trying to be furniture. She carried a tray of pan-seared scallops and a bottle of something that cost more than her rent. And she did not spill a drop. Marlowe was fat. Not curvy, in the way magazines used the word when they wanted credit for kindness. They didn't mean genuinely, unmistakably fat. At 285 pounds, in a body that collected stares, the way a windshield collects rain, constant, unbidden, and never quite acknowledged by the people doing the staring. In a dining room where the hostesses looked like they'd been poured from the same silver mold. Marlowe was an anomaly, and the anomaly got assigned to the back sections, the private rooms, where the clientele valued discretion over decoration, and nobody complained about who poured the water so long as the water got poured. Marlowe didn't mind being invisible. She'd built a whole second life out of it 4 years ago. Marlowe Ashford had been one of the Army's most gifted field linguists, stationed at a converted airbase outside Sierra Vista, Arizona, fluent in 6 languages and capable of untangling regional slang that broke every machine translation model the Pentagon threw at it. She'd been on the fast track to a civilian intelligence post until she found a compartmentalized surveillance program that had nothing to do with the enemies it claimed to be watching, and everything to do with silencing 2 sitting congresswomen. She tried to report it through channels. The channels ate her alive. Within 8 months, she was quietly discharged, unofficially blacklisted from every contractor in a 50-mile radius of the Beltway, and drowning in a depression so total it triggered a thyroid crash that packed 85 pounds onto her frame in under a year. Her older sister, Denise, called every Sunday from Ohio and asked the same question in a dozen different disguises. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you seeing anyone? Are you still angry? Marlowe always said she was fine. She had rehearsed the lie so many times it came out smooth as the water she poured for strangers. The truth was that she missed the version of herself who used to brief colonels without blinking, who could hear 3 seconds of intercepted audio and place the speaker's home village within 100 miles. That woman had been erased so thoroughly that Marlowe sometimes wondered if she'd imagined her. She kept a single souvenir from that life, a chipped NSA coffee mug she used to water a dying pothos plant on her windowsill, and told herself that was closure enough. Now she hid behind an oversized black apron and a name tag that said Marlowe in cheerful cursive. And all she wanted, most nights, was to get through her shift without being seen. She had gotten good at it. Good enough that she sometimes went entire 8-hour shifts without a single customer looking directly at her face, which she had decided, somewhere along the way, counted as a form of peace. Tonight, that plan was about to catch fire. At 11:15, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open, and the maitre d', nearly tripped over his own polished shoes, clearing the path. Cormac Doyle walked in like weather. Cormac ran the Doyle organization, a construction and logistics empire that laundered blood money through concrete pores and union locals, and did it with the kind of iron discipline that made lesser men develop stutters. He was 36, built like a closing argument, and dressed in a midnight blue pinstripe suit that cost more than Marlowe's annual salary twice over. He smelled like cedar smoke and the cold air off the harbor. Behind him came his second, a broad-shouldered man named Rourke, and a visibly sweating stranger clutching a leather portfolio to his chest, like a life raft. A man Marlowe would later learn was named Wesley. There was a rhythm to how a room reorganized itself around men like Cormac Doyle. Marlowe had studied it the way she used to study syntax trees, back when studying things for a living had still been an option available to her. Waiters straightened. Regulars who normally commanded the room went quiet and small. Even the sommelier, a man who'd once lectured a senator on the impropriety of ice in red wine, suddenly found something urgent to do in the far corner of the dining room. Power. Marlowe had decided long ago, had its own dialect, and every single person in this restaurant spoke it fluently, except her. Because nobody had ever bothered addressing a single sentence of it to a fat woman holding a water pitcher, Marlowe was assigned the table. She poured the sparkling water without a word, eyes down, and felt the tension at the table settle over her like a wet coat. Cormac ignored the menu entirely. His attention was locked on the sweating man across from him. "I don't pay you $185,000 a year to guess." Wesley. His voice was low and unhurried, and it didn't carry past the table. But it landed like a dropped anvil. "Mr. Doyle, I'm trying." Wesley's hands shook as he slid a stack of printouts across the tablecloth. The wiretap from the Bayonne safe house. The audio's garbage. The Dragonovich crew is mixing Shid prison cant with old Yugoslav slang. It's highly irregular. Irregular. Cormac leaned back, adjusting a black onyx signet ring on his right hand without looking at it. The shipment lands at the Bayonne yards at 2 a.m. I need to know if Nikola Dragonovich caught wind of the reroute. If you can't read this transcript, my men walk into a blind spot. And if they walk into a blind spot, he leaned forward, voice dropping to almost nothing, you won't be walking anywhere. Ever again. Marlowe stepped up to refill Cormac's glass. Her hand didn't shake. Her mind, however, was already sprinting. She caught a glimpse of the Cyrillic-adjacent scrawl scattered across the printouts, and some dormant, stubborn part of her brain started parsing grammar and phonetics before she could stop it. Wesley noticed her lingering half a second too long and, desperate to deflect the boss's fury onto someone else, snapped. "What are you looking at?" "Tugboat. Top off the water and waddle off. This is classified." Marlowe froze. Her cheeks went hot. The insult was lazy and familiar, the kind she'd absorbed so many times it barely registered as new tugboat. Forklift. House. She had a private, bitter catalogue of all of them by now. Filed away, the same way she used to file dialects. Except tonight, underneath the old, worn shame, something sparked that felt almost like anger. She thought, unbidden. Two of the last time, a room full of men in expensive suits had dismissed her out loud, a conference room at Fort Huachuca. 3 years and a lifetime ago. where a colonel had told her that raising concerns about the surveillance program would be career suicide, in a tone that suggested he found the idea faintly amusing. She had believed, then, that competence would eventually be its own defense. She no longer believed that. She pulled the picture back and started to turn away. Cormac glanced up at her. His gaze was cold, and assessing, he took in the size of her, the strain of her uniform, the soft double set of her chin, and he didn't look disgusted. He looked worse, entirely dismissive. "Leave it, Wesley," he said, without a trace of kindness. "Her expertise is clearly in dessert wine, not signals intelligence. Don't take your incompetence out on the help." A couple of his men snickered. Something behind Marlowe's ribs cracked open. She looked at Wesley, who was jabbing a finger at a line on the transcript. "Here, Mr. Doilade frase, krno cveche." It translates to black flowers. I believe it's their code for police presence. They're saying the cops will be waiting at the docks. "We should abort." Marlowe didn't mean to speak. The words came out anyway. Propelled by 3 years of buried competence and one reckless spike of defiance. "That's not what it means," she said quietly. The table went dead silent. Even the clatter from the next room seemed to fall into a hole. 4 hardened men, 1 terrified linguist, and the most dangerous man on the East Coast all turned to stare at the fat waitress holding a water pitcher. Cormac tilted his head. "Excuse me," Marlowe swallowed. "Herr Pulsehammer." But she'd already jumped. In standard usage. "Sur." Black flowers means police. But in Shid dialect, the one the Dragonovich crew actually speaks, black flowers is old prison slang for a controlled demolition. They're not warning each other about cops. They're describing a trap. Wesley's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about. You delusional Mr. Doyle." "She's a waitress. She probably picked that up from a Netflix show." Cormac raised one hand, and the table went silent. Instantly. He never took his eyes off Marlowe. "And how?" he asked, soft and mocking. "Does a waitress at the Stag know the finer points of Balkan prison code? Did you swallow a dictionary along with the breadbasket?" His men chuckled. A hot tear of frustration threatened, and Marlowe blinked it back, spine straightening. "Because I know the dialect," she said. "Steadier now. And I know that if you send your men to Bayonne tonight, they're not walking into an arrest. They're walking into a fireball. For one absurd, suspended second." She thought about walking away, setting the pitcher down, untying her apron, and quietly disappearing out the service, exit the way she'd trained herself to disappear from every uncomfortable room for the last 3 years. It would have been easy. Nobody in that room expected competence from her, which meant nobody would have chased it once it left. But some old, stubborn part of her, the part that had once briefed a room of colonels without blinking, the part she'd tried so hard to bury under an oversized apron and 85 extra pounds, refused to let the moment go to waste. She had spent 3 years being underestimated. She was not. Apparently. "I'm going to spend 1 more minute of tonight the same way." Cormac stared at her for a long, unbearable moment. The mockery drained out of his face, replaced by something colder and far more calculating. He picked up the transcript, traced the line with a leather-gloved finger, then stood all 6'4" of him, towering over the table, and slammed the entire stack down in front of her. "If you're so smart," he said, loud enough to make Rourke flinch. "Then translate it. All of it. Right now. Prove to me you're not just an attention-starved waitress with a hobby." "Boss, you cannot be serious," Wesley started. "Shut your mouth." "Wesley, before I let Rourke do it for you," Cormac said, without looking away from Marlowe. He tapped the paper. "Read it." Marlowe set the picture down. Her hands trembled for exactly 1 second. And then, as her eyes hit the page, the trembling stopped entirely. The ciphers, the fractured grammar, the deliberate misdirection. It was a puzzle, and her brain had always been a locksmith for puzzles. She leaned over the table, scanning fast. The room was so quiet. She could hear Cormac's watchless wrist tapping against the linen. "This isn't about the shipment at all," she murmured, brow furrowing. She pulled a pen from her apron pocket and began crossing out Wesley's notes, scrawling corrections in the margin. He missed the modifier. He translated Mirtavak as dead man, assumed it meant a target, but paired with the prefix za. It means behind the dead man. Behind the dead man, Rourke echoed. Confused, Marlowe looked up, her eyes meeting Cormac's. "Where's your father buried?" "Mr. Doyle." Cormac's whole body went rigid. The careless arrogance evaporated, replaced with something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Woodside Memorial Gardens. Staten Island." Marlowe looked back down at the page. "They're not hitting your shipment at Bayonne. That's a decoy, meant to pull your top people out of the city. The real strike happens tomorrow." She traced the line with her pen. "When the sun visits the dead man to lay the stones, the black flowers will bloom. Tomorrow's the anniversary of your father's death." "Isn't it?" Cormac didn't answer. He didn't have to. Rourke had gone the color of the tablecloth, which told Marlowe everything she needed to know every year. On the anniversary of the old Doyle patriarch's murder, Cormac visited the family mausoleum with minimal security to pay his respects alone. If someone had wired the crypt with explosives black flowers, Cormac would be reduced to a headline by lunchtime. They planted charges in the family plot, Cormac said, the realization landing on him like a physical weight. He turned his head slowly toward Wesley, who was already backing toward the wall, tears streaking his face. "Mr. Doyle, I swear to God, I didn't know. It's an obscure regional cant. I ran it through every algorithm we Rourke. In one motion." Rourke seized Wesley by the collar and drove his face into the mahogany table. The crack of cartilage was sickening. He dragged the sobbing, bleeding linguist out through the service door without a word. Marlowe gasped and stepped back, hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't a crossword. This was death, casually dispensed a few feet from her tray of scallops. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a cola. More analytical part of her, the part that used to grade junior analysts on their composure under pressure, noted, almost clinically, that she had not screamed or flinched away entirely, that she had simply catalogued the sound the way she once catalogued phonemes. She hated how useful that part of her still was. She hated more how good it felt to be useful again. Cormac turned back to her. The mockery was gone completely. For the first time in 4 years, a man was looking at Marlowe Ashford, and not seeing a fat girl standing between him and his dinner. He was seeing a weapon. "Who are you?" His voice had gone rough. "Marlowe," she whispered, heart slamming against her ribs. I'm just a waitress." Cormac stepped closer, looming. But there was no threat in it this time. Just a strange, magnetic curiosity. A waitress doesn't correct a Pentagon-trained analyst on the fly. A waitress doesn't pass prison cant in real time. "Where did you learn that?" "I can't say." He reached out. Marlowe flinched, bracing for a grab. But instead, his hand closed gently around her wrist, thumb resting against her frantic pulse. "You just saved my life," he said, dropping his voice to something dangerously intimate. "You saved my life, and made my $185,000 linguist look like a toddler. You think I'm letting you go back to pouring wine? I need this job," Marlowe stammered, trying to tug her wrist free. His grip didn't budge. "Please, just tip well and let me go." Cormac actually laughed, a low, genuine sound that raised the hair on her arms. "I'll buy this restaurant outright if I have to." He released her wrist and gestured toward the door. "Get your coat. You're coming with us." "What? No." Marlowe backed up until she hit the edge of the service station. "I'm not getting into a car with organized crime. I'm calling the police." Cormac stepped into her space, close enough that the cedar smoke scent of him crowded out everything else. "In 10 minutes. The Dragonovich crew is going to realize their trap's been compromised. When they trace it back, they won't find Wesley. My people are already erasing him, but they have eyes in this room. They know I was here tonight. They'll find out." A waitress was standing at this table when the plan fell apart. His voice held no threat, only a flat, terrible fact. "If you stay here, you're dead before sunrise. You're coming with me because it's the only way you live to see Thursday." A dark, predatory amusement flickered across his mouth. "And because I have 11 more encrypted drives back at the house, and I just lost my translator." He didn't wait for an argument. He turned and walked toward the exit, coat billowing behind him. "Rourke," he called over his shoulder. "Get Marlowe's coat. Clear out her locker. She doesn't work here anymore." Marlowe stood frozen in the middle of the ruined dining room, staring at the smear of blood on the mahogany where Wesley's face had been seconds ago. She'd spent 3 years trying to disappear. Now, the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard had seen her completely, and she understood, with sick clarity, that he was never going to let her vanish again. The drive from Mercer Street to the Doyle family compound in Greenwich, Connecticut, was an hour and 40 minutes of suffocating silence. Marlowe sat rigid in the back of an armored Range Rover, fingers white-knuckled around the lapels of her cheap winter coat, which suddenly felt like tissue paper against the reality she'd just been dropped into. Cormac sat across from her, a shadow wrapped in wool and quiet menace. His attention locked on the glow of an encrypted phone. The bluish light cut sharp shadows across his jaw. He was a predator, resting between kills, when the Range Rover finally rolled past 12-foot iron gates and up a gravel drive lined with floodlights. Marlowe's breath caught. The estate looked like a modern castle, built by someone who'd read too much Fitzgerald and taken it as instruction stone walls. Patrolling men with dogs, and windows that glowed gold against the dark. Cormac didn't offer her a guest room to catch her breath. There wasn't time. He led her past a sweeping staircase and a crystal chandelier straight down into a subterranean command center that looked nothing like the marble above it. Humming server racks, tactical maps, 6 monitors glowing in the dark. On the wall by the door hung a single, slightly crooked, framed photograph of an older man with Cormac's same hard jaw. Standing outside a construction site with his arm around a boy who couldn't have been older than 10, Marlowe noticed Cormac's eyes flick to it, without meaning to. The way a tongue finds a broken tooth. Before he looked away, he tossed a heavy, encrypted hard drive onto a steel desk. "The Dragonovich crew is moving fast," he said, shrugging out of his suit jacket to reveal a black shoulder holster strapped across his chest. "Wesley was supposed to crack this drive 2 days ago. My whole network is blind until I know what's on it. I need it done tonight." Marlowe stared at the blinking cursor. Her old life, the one she'd buried under 3 years of aprons and invisibility, whispered in her ear. And for the first time since the day she'd been discharged, the whisper sounded like relief instead of grief. She sat down in the leather chair, pulled herself forward, and cracked her knuckles. "I need black coffee. No sugar. And a room with no interruptions." Cormac's eyebrow ticked upward. Clearly he wasn't used to taking orders in his own bunker, but the ghost of a smirk crossed his mouth as he nodded to a guard at the door. "You don't ask why I trust a stranger with all of this," Marlowe said, testing him, as the guard set a mug of black coffee at her elbow. "I don't trust you," Cormac said, matter-of-factly, pulling a chair around and straddling it backward across from her. "I trust that you just saved my life in front of 9 witnesses. Which means either you're exactly what you say you are, or you're a better actress than anyone I've ever met. In which case, I'd still rather have you working for me than against me." He studied her for a long moment. "Why did you leave whatever you did before? A woman with your skill set doesn't end up pouring wine by accident." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "I found something I wasn't supposed to find. I reported it through the proper channels. Like an idiot. The channels reported me instead." She didn't elaborate. And to her mild surprise, he didn't push. "Sounds familiar," he said quietly. And something in the way he said it made her wonder, briefly, whether the Doyle organization had once tried to do something honest too, a long time ago, before the concrete pours and the union locals swallowed it whole. "Your father built it that way, didn't he?" Marlowe said, nodding at the crooked photograph on the wall. "Concrete and unions. Something people actually needed." Cormac's expression flickered surprise, then something closer to grudging respect. He used to say a man could hide anything behind a foundation pour, so long as the building above it stood up straight. He shook his head slightly, as if shaking off the memory. "Coffee's getting cold. Get to work. Ms. Ashford." It was the first time anyone had used her last name in 3 years without a clipboard attached to it, and it landed somewhere in her chest. She hadn't expected it to reach, for 7 straight hours. Marlowe lived entirely inside the code. The Dragonovich crew's cyber people had layered a rotating cipher that reshuffled itself every 8 seconds. But Marlowe recognized the bones of it almost immediately, an outdated, heavily patched framework she'd spent a full year dissecting back at Sierra Vista. By 5:40 in the morning, fingers flying across the keyboard in a steady, furious rhythm, she cracked the final firewall. Hundreds of files spilled across the dual monitors, wire transfers routed through shell entities in Malta, black market shipping manifests, a folder of encrypted audio marked with a single red flag. One document in particular stopped her cold. It was an internal memo, dictated by Nikola Dragonovich himself. referencing an embedded asset inside the Doyle organization's own leadership. Cormac walked into the bunker just as Marlowe let out a sharp breath. He'd changed into a fitted black Henley that pulled tight across his chest, carrying not coffee, but a full plate of food grilled ribeye, roasted fingerling potatoes, charred broccolini. "Eat," he said, setting the tray beside her keyboard, before he caught sight of her face and went still. "What did you find?" "Tormats." The first name slipped out before she caught it. "The Dragonovich crew didn't guess your father's private visiting route at Woodside. They didn't rely on outside surveillance. Someone told them." She clicked the first audio file. The room filled with a burner phone call. The voice distorted, but the cadence, a faint, unmistakable Belfast lilt, buried under the static, was instantly recognizable to anyone who'd grown up in this family's orbit. It was Padraig, Cormac's oldest advisor, and his late father's closest friend. Cormac stared at the monitor, the betrayal carved deep, harsh lines into his face. But he didn't explode. He didn't throw the monitor or scream. A terrible, absolute calm settled over him, instead the kind of calm Marlowe had only ever seen in men who had already decided, somewhere past language, exactly what they were going to do next. "Padraig held me at my own father's funeral," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "He taught me how to shake a man's hand and read his pulse at the same time. He taught me everything I know about who to trust. A muscle worked in his jaw, and he sold my father's grave to the Dragonovich crew for a number I could have paid him 10 times over. If he'd only asked." He reached out and rested a large, calloused hand on Marlowe's shoulder, grounding her trembling body more than his own. "You have a rare gift, Marlowe," he murmured, thumb brushing the side of her neck, sending an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "A very beautiful, very dangerous gift." The next afternoon, Marlowe woke in a guest suite bigger than her entire apartment back in Queens. Sitting on the edge of a plush ottoman at the foot of the bed were several elegantly wrapped boxes. Cormac hadn't just pulled her into his violent world. He'd sent a personal shopper to a boutique on Greenwich Avenue. Inside, the boxes were cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers, and delicate silk blouses, all in her exact size 26. They weren't the shapeless tents she usually bought to disappear into. These were high-fashion pieces, cut deliberately to skim her curves, cinch at the waist, and flatter her wide hips rather than hide them. When Marlowe finally came downstairs to the main parlor, dressed in a deep burgundy silk blouse tucked into black tailored trousers, Cormac stopped mid-sentence in a tense conversation with Rourke. His dark eyes locked onto her immediately, tracing her soft, thick silhouette with an open, consuming hunger that made her face flush with heat. He didn't look at her and see an invisible waitress. He looked at her like she was something worth guarding, Padraig's being dealt with. He said, voice dropping an octave as he crossed the room toward her, leaving Rourke behind. "But the Dragonovich crew will realize their mole's gone dark, fast. They're going to move quickly. And they're going to move ugly." Before he could finish laying out his counter-strategy, the estate's perimeter alarm tore through the halls a deafening shriek, followed by steel shutters slamming down over every window and the halls flooding with flashing red emergency light. "Breach! On the east wall," Rourke shouted, racking the slide of his rifle. "Multiple hostile. Heavily armed. Moving fast. The Dragonovich crew hadn't waited to confirm Padreg's fate. Sensing the leak was already compromised. Nicola had launched a full frontal assault on the Greenwich compound to eliminate Cormac before he could retaliate. Gunfire erupted outside, dull and relentless through the thick stone walls. Cormac grabbed Marlowe's hand, grip iron tight. Unyielding. "Stay with me. Do not let go." He hauled her down the marble hallway, sprinting for the fortified panic room below. A massive explosion tore through the west wing, showering plaster and dust from the ceiling. The security feeds on Rourke's tablet flickered and died into static. They hit the main transformer and the backup generators. He shouted over the chaos. "We're blind on cameras. The armory's electronic locks are fried. We can't get to the heavy weapons." Kormats fore in low. Clipped Irish curses. Without the armory, his men were badly outgunned by the wave of mercenaries pouring across the lawn. Through the reinforced glass of the stairwell, Marlowe caught a glimpse of the grounds outside floodlights cutting through smoke, muzzle flashes stuttering across the tree line. One of Cormac's men dragging a wounded colleague behind an overturned planter. Her stomach lurched. This was not a puzzle on a screen. This was a body count accumulating in real time. And every second she froze was a second closer to Cormac's name being added to it. Marlowe's heart hammered. But the panic sharpened. Suddenly, into something clear and cold and useful. Her photographic memory pulled up the architectural schematics she'd skimmed while cracking the encryption the night before. The central ventilation system. She shouted over the gunfire. Cormac snapped his head toward her. Stunned. The server network runs on an isolated battery backup. Right. The schematics showed a manual override for the whole HVAC system down in the sub-basement mechanical room. It does. What good is air conditioning while we're being shot at? He kept his body between her and the hallway. The Dragonovich crew is using oxygen-fed breaching charges to blow doors. Marlowe said. Mind racing. If we reverse the air pressure and flood the corridors with the halon gas from the fire suppression tanks, it strips the oxygen out of the air. Their charges fail to detonate, and anyone without a mask goes down fast. But I need to get to that mechanical room right now. Cormac didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He trusted her completely. Hold the stairwell, he told Rourke, then pushed Marlowe behind his broad frame. Glock raised. They moved through darkened service corridors. 2 armed mercenaries rounded a corner. Cormac fired twice. Clean headshots. And stepped over the bodies without breaking stride. They reached the sweltering mechanical room. Marlowe threw her weight against the old metal control panel, ripping open the access cover, fingers flying over a dusty keypad, entering the override codes she'd memorized from the encrypted files. Come on. Come on. Sweat rolled down her temple. Boots pounded down the metal stairwell behind them. Take your time. Marlowe, Cormac said, absurdly calm, taking cover behind a steel support column and returning precise fire as a squad tried to breach the door. Marlowe hauled the manual release lever down with everything she had. A groan ripped through the building's foundation, followed by the hiss of halon gas flooding the ventilation shafts above. Through the vents, the triumphant shouts of the invading mercenaries turned into panicked, wet coughing. Their breaching charges sparked and died in the oxygen-starved air. Rourke and Cormac's men, already fitted with emergency masks from the panic room stockpile, swept the upper floors and subdued the choking attackers with brutal efficiency. A heavy silence settled over the wrecked estate. Cormac lowered his weapon and turned to look at her. She was slumped against the control panel, gasping, her burgundy blouse coated in grey dust, dark hair escaping its bun. She looked exhausted, terrified, and, to him, entirely magnificent. He closed the distance in 3 strides, and, without a word, pinned her gently back against the console, hands sliding into her hair, and kissed her like the building was still on fire. Marlowe gasped against his mouth and then, surrendering completely to the adrenaline, kissed him back, yielding to the raw, possessive heat of a dangerous man who had finally, actually seen her. His hands moved over her soft, heavy curves with a fierce reverence that quietly incinerated every insecurity she'd ever carried about her body. When he finally pulled back to breathe, forehead resting against hers in the dim light, he said, "You are never leaving my side again. You're my translator, my strategist, and mine. Anyone who ever makes you feel small again won't live long enough to regret it. Do you understand me?" Marlowe. She looked up at the ruthless, blood-stained man who had finally seen her worth, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled him back down. "I understand," she whispered. The weeks that followed unraveled faster than either of them expected. Federal agents raided a warehouse in Bayonne 2 days after the siege and found enough documentation on the Dragonovich cruise arms pipeline to keep a task force busy for a decade. Documentation that arrived on a very specific desk through a very anonymous tip, translated, annotated, and organized with the meticulous precision of someone who used to do this for a living. Nikola Dragonovich was arrested boarding a private charter out of Teterboro 3 weeks later, and the case against him leaned so heavily on decrypted communications that the prosecuting attorney privately admitted, off the record, that she had no idea where half the material had come from and had decided not to ask. Marlowe's old life did not so much return as quietly forgive her. A former colleague from Sierra Vista, now working congressional oversight, reached out after seeing an unattributed brief cross a subcommittee desk that sounded exactly like your old voice. Marlowe didn't confirm anything. She didn't have to. 2 months later, the surveillance program she'd tried to expose years earlier was finally, formally dismantled, buried under a mountain of newly declassified evidence that nobody could quite trace back to its source. Denise called that Sunday and, for the first time in 3 years, didn't ask if Marlowe was eating. She asked who the man was in the photo Marlowe had accidentally sent instead of a grocery list. And Marlowe, laughing for what felt like the first time in years, told her it was a long story. Cormac never asked her to go back to being invisible. If anything, he seemed almost offended by the idea, as though the years she'd spent disappearing had been a personal insult to his intelligence for not noticing her sooner. He built her an office next to his own in the Greenwich compound. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Better hardware than the Pentagon had ever given her. And a standing rule that nobody, not Rourke, not the accountants, not the men who still occasionally forgot themselves and stared a beat too long, was permitted to comment on her body in her presence, on pain of a conversation with him personally that nobody wanted to have twice. On the 6-month anniversary of the night, he'd shoved a blood-stained transcript in her face and dared her to translate it. Cormac took her back to the Gilded Stag, booked the same private room, and ordered the same scallops she'd once carried on a tray with her eyes cast down. When the new hire poured their water with the same practiced, Invisible grace Marlowe used to have. Cormac reached across the table, took her hand, and said, quietly, that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure the whole world saw exactly what he saw. Marlowe, for once, didn't look away. What a wild, high-stakes ride. That was Marlowe's brilliant mind and unshakable presence, finally getting the respect they always deserved. If you loved watching Marlowe outsmart an entire crime syndicate and win over the most dangerous man in Connecticut, smash that like button. Share this story with a friend who needs a reminder that being underestimated is a weapon. And subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching.